Ever since I got a record that had like technical issues and frame drops, like my local recording button is just the first thing I click at this point.
Yeah, it's funny. That happens once, and all of a sudden that changes. All of a sudden you're recording everything. Good luck. Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break, a podcast that features conversations with speedrunners, developers, content creators, and everything in between. Welcome. This is episode 62. I can't even talk. This is episode 62. AgentWyvern, how you doing? Thanks so much for being here.
Doing good, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's lovely. I was going to say summer's day, but then I realized it's both not summer and also no longer day.
Well, you may notice that. So we're on different time zones, and you might be the first person where I actually got the time zone correct. Where are you in the world, by the way?
I'm in England, in the UK. Currently very cloudy. Winter's evening. There we go. Got it right that time.
Hey, yes, there is no more summer, unfortunately. It's changing the season, unless you're in other parts of the world. So,
That's true.
Anywho, thanks so much for being here. So for those that aren't familiar, AgentWyvern, I think, do you have a submission in every single Castlevania Rondo of Blood category?
There's technically a couple that I don't, but that's only on like the other version. So like the PlayStation 4 version, I don't have a couple in there. But every type of category, yes, currently. As of yesterday.
Awesome. That is so cool. We're going to do, so this is something I've been wanting to do for a while, and it's basically, it's really one of my favorite games of all time. And this is going to be Castlevania Rondo of Blood. We're going to take kind of a deep dive into it, and no perfect person better than AgentWyvern, who, like I said, runs almost every category and is also one of the moderators on speedrunning.com for the leaderboard and everything. And I got to tell you, the way that you're able to talk about the game, you've done some tutorials, done a bunch of great stuff. So I'm super excited for this. Let's take it all back. Let's first start. When did you get your start in gaming? What were some of the games that you were playing as a kid?
So I think my earliest memory of anything involving a video game was, I think my mum had a computer in her bedroom, and I think it had something called Reader Rabbit on, which was like a very early learning game.
Yeah, totally.
I remember jumping around and trying to solve puzzles and stuff. But in terms of an actual like video game console, I started off with the Dreamcast. I remember anytime I wanted to go online on it, that was it, no phone calls for the day. And then there'd be sort of concerned grandparents wondering why they can't get through to the house, or it's because Wyvern's playing video games. But no, I like that. I used to play a couple of games like Revolt and Vigilante Second Defense. And then I eventually sort of moved on to like the GameCube, the Game Boy Advance, and sort of kind of progressed from there, eventually getting into online PC games and stuff as well.
Very cool. Now, so if you don't mind me explaining some of the consoles that back in the day, at least in England, you're growing up with, was TurboGrafx 16 or anything like that even around? Had you even heard of a console like this?
I don't know, because it would have been, I think, the Core Graphics over here, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it was.
Oh, okay, so it's called. That's right. It is. You're right. It's Core Graphics, and that's right in Europe.
It was a few years before my time, so like it was the earliest I remember was sort of everyone was sort of on the N64, Dreamcast, PlayStation 1 sort of generation. I probably hadn't even heard of earlier consoles than that until a few years later when I sort of started watching YouTube and stuff like that.
Dreamcast is one of those consoles I really want to get into. They're still, you can still get them, but now there's some really great hardware being developed for them. So you can the what they call it, the drive emulators and everything, where they can, you don't need the discs and things like that. Do you still have a Dreamcast in the house or anything like that?
I do. I still have my original Dreamcast. I was sort of like, everyone else always used to trade in games, and I know trading in games and like for credit and whatever else was always very popular, but I was always someone for one reason or another that never traded in, so I've pretty much kept everything I sort of grew up with. So I still have like the original Dreamcast and all the games in the cupboard, but I always find the boxes for those things, though, like the covers, they always used to fall apart so easily. And just like, it's a complete sort of mess trying to put them back together again. And I've still got all the original stuff and all the discount stickers that were still on them, telling you like 2 for 1 on these games that no one else is buying.
Absolutely. I wish I would have been one of those kids that did get rid of their stuff. Like, I regret it nowadays, but yes, I grew up in that generation where we were actually renting games as well. And so there's usually, you didn't keep a lot of, at least in my household, we didn't keep a lot of games around it. It's a real bummer now because you can play your old game. It's so awesome.
Oh, I can thank my mum for that one, because it was her idea to keep all like the Pokemon game boxes. Like, the collector in me now is like, thank you,
Yeah.
thank you.
If only all parents were like you. Oh my gosh, that's so great. So how did you discover speedrunning, or what was your in? How did you get into the speedrunning thing then?
I'm not entirely sure, actually. Like, I have a vague recollection that I was watching a video about a John Cena meme, and then all of a sudden there was a recommended video that was speedrunning related, and ooh, what was this? I don't remember what the specific one was, though. I think I found it, and it was like, oh, this is kind of interesting, really, which is a surprise, because I would be like the last person you would ever expect to get into speedrunning. Because I growing up playing games, I hated time trials, I hated time attacks, I hated anything involving being against the clock. I used to actively avoid it in video games. So it's now it's now rather unusual that I've somehow ended up speedrunning. But as for I don't know, actually, really, I can't remember. I used to watch some of the games that I grew up with, like Pokemon Ruby. I was like very eager to see sort of speedruns of that. And I suppose you initially, like a lot of people, you initially seek the speedruns you're nostalgic for before sort of moving on to other things.
It's a really good point, and you might be the first person ever that's mentioned John Cena on this podcast. So there we go. That's a first
time for everything.
There really is. I mean, the YouTube. I mean, that's if there's one thing it's designed to do, it's designed to fill your time with stuff.
You're watching a video about how to solve a computer problem, and then suddenly it's 6 hours later watching a cat fall off a settee. It's like, what's going on?
So, if you don't mind me asking, so outside of the speedrun, what are some of the games you've enjoyed the most? Like, what are some of your like more favorite games?
Probably a lot of online games. I played a lot of RuneScape growing up, World of Warcraft. I was a big fan of StarCraft 2, mainly watching it, but I love playing it as well. Minecraft as well. I again, that was another game I used to watch a lot. And so in a way, a lot of games that I have nostalgia for are also games that I watched a lot of videos of rather than sort of actively playing myself. Yeah, but mainly there's all sorts. I even remember Club Penguin in there I used to play for some reason. Rocket League. A lot of different sort of games over the years, I suppose.
Yeah, you brought up a really good point, and this is actually, I think, probably one of the ways that I found speedrunning was looking up the games you're nostalgic for, you know, and that's that's a very easy in to get you into seeing somebody play it as fast as they possibly can. What was like your first speedrunning attempt, or you know, what kind of gave you that impetus to actually try some of this thing out?
Well, I think it was just a case of I liked the idea of having a permanent sort of record of what you've achieved in something. And that's the idea of having like your own sort of speedrun page and having your own times recorded. And it felt like every time I was playing the game then, or I was almost working towards something, which is a feeling I like having in most things, is the feeling of achieving something.
Yeah.
So I think I was also wanting to get into streaming at the time. And I noticed that, well, okay, even if nobody watches me, which I didn't ever expect anyone to watch me, so I was like, okay, even if no one watches me, it still makes sense to stream a speedrun, so you've got a live recording. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a good idea. And so that's kind of like, okay, let's try some speedruns. And then it was a case of moving on to sort of deciding exactly what I wanted to run, trying out a couple different things, and seeing what sort of stuck.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because regretfully, I didn't record my first few streams, especially attempts of speedruns and things like that. And nowadays, I'll even record my playthroughs so that I can go back and take a look. Maybe there's something I might have accidentally discovered or things like that. It can actually be, especially if you're into, the details of games and things like that. It's a great way to record it and keep it, stream and local record plus pray nothing borks. Well, that's a good point, Zolo. That's a very good point.
It's always good to be able to look back and stuff. And I think that's the other thing is like I like the idea of that in 5-10 years time I can look back and see, oh, what's this random personal best in Castlevania from 10 years ago that I got.
Exactly. So we've been talking a little bit around the corners here about nostalgia and things like that. How did you end up finding Rondo of Blood then, and what led you to want to try to speedrun that game?
It's been a fascination with Castlevania for years. It's one of those things I'd always been interested in. I always heard some of the music tracks I've always really liked ever since I first watched an Area of Sorrow Let's Play on YouTube several years ago. And that was kind of my first sort of experience seeing Castlevania. And then I'd seen a few different videos over the years, and I think I only tried it once or twice. The first Castlevania I tried was like Lords of Shadow. Played it for 15 minutes, never looked at the disc again. Then it was, I think I tried Castlevania 1 briefly years ago, and at the time I didn't get it. And it was only when I was like, okay, I'm really going to give Castlevania a proper go a couple years ago. And I saw that they had just released Requiem on PS4. So that was the ported PSP ports of Rondo and Symphony of the Night. It's like, oh, okay, this seems like a perfect opportunity to try. And from the very first screen of playing Rondo of Blood, I'm like, oh, this is Castlevania. This is what I've been missing. Is it? Okay, this is incredible. And just the more I played through the game, I was like, this is really good. And I think I was already at this point in the back of my mind thinking about speedrunning and exactly where did I want to start. And I'm like, okay, this is perfect.
Okay, so that's a really good point, and I don't know if you have this opinion or not, but having played through, so I basically played through almost all of the Castlevania games now on the first and second generation, except some of the portable titles, some of the Game Boy titles. And after playing all these, I really feel like Rondo is the perfect gateway to actually try getting into, if you're into the Castlevania series at all, or maybe if you're not, because it's got a great degree of challenge, but also presents so many of the wonderful mechanics that can exist in Castlevania in general. And it sounds like you might have had some of that similar discovery in your first playthrough.
It's very much, to me, Rondo is like the classic style perfected in a way. Others may have differing opinions on
totally
that, but
agree.
I just think that the graphics, the sound, the gameplay, it takes a lot of the NES style, and then almost just it makes it not as brutal in a way. It doesn't feel that unforgiving or unfair compared to some of the earlier entries. Obviously, a lot of Castlevania 4, CV4 is another one that I think is probably that would probably be the one I would recommend if people just want to experience it for the first time, because it tends to be a little easier. I mean, I'm not someone that grew up playing difficult games, and so I definitely appreciate the sort of the decreasing difficulty on that one.
It's funny you mentioned that, because it's actually the one I'm playing through right now is a CV4, and I'm really enjoying the playthrough. I'm only a couple hours in. I'm thinking 4 levels or something like that. But I totally agree with you that that's actually probably, especially because a lot of people have a Super Nintendo or a Super Famicom as well. That might be a little bit more, and it's available basically on ported everywhere nowadays. So there are some things that I found interesting about the game itself, and one of them was that it's a little bit easier to look back at it historically, because it bridges this gap between these first couple of generations of consoles and what we get in Symphony of the Night, and it so much so that the last part of Rondo of Blood is the first part. It's the very beginning of Symphony of the Night, and there was this so if you actually, first of all, if you collect or anything like that, the original TurboGrafx 16 CD, or the PC Engine CD, I should say, because it's not available. Was never North American, is not a cheap disc to own nowadays, just to say the least. Popular game, all those kind of things. But it has this great section of liner notes in the CD itself, and it has interviews with the developers for the game. And one of the things I found really fascinating is that the developers talked about how they were freed up to kind of design basically whatever they wanted with this game, within the constraints, obviously, of a budget and time and all that kind of stuff. And being that it wasn't coming out for the North American audience, they didn't have to censor. So we got all of these really wonderful custom and interesting sprites and graphics and music. I mean, all these things that just feel like that none of the other games really had. They really got a chance to do whatever they want, it seems like.
Yeah, I think that was really exciting. It's not just sort of where it's also being released, but also the hardware, finally on a CD-ROM gave them the sort of the freedom of expression to really say, okay, this is what we can do with Castlevania at the time, and this is how far we can sort of push boundaries and whatnot. And I was reading, how about how they had to almost tone things down a little bit in terms of difficulty, or sprites that were like couldn't even the PC Engine couldn't quite handle. But it really sounded like they were really trying to push the boundaries, and I think that showed sort of in the final product, really.
I totally agree. And, you can obviously tell there's influences from the previous, from all of the games that came before it. Yet there's this really kind of just unique thing about it. There's some of the discovery in the game happens, some of the branching paths you can take, all those kind of things were really, you can obviously see where Symphony of the Night comes next. I think that's a part of it as well, like where we had this quote unquote Metrovania style game. And so your first playthrough, what was or at least your earliest playthroughs of the game? What was it like? What were some of your experiences? What were some of the things that you really enjoyed from the game?
So I just felt that it controlled very well. Like, again, my only previous experience before that of playing a classic Castlevania was Castlevania 1. And obviously I love that game now, but at the time that was very, very different to anything else I played. Yes. But Rondo felt like that was but a lot more refined. And it just like immediately I was hit from the different graphics, the music of the stages, and it was really encapsulating very quickly. It was also somewhat frustrating in the initial playthrough. I got to stage 5, and it was a tricky time indeed. It was actually, I was almost so familiar with that level by the time I got to the speedrun, because I played through it so many times because I kept game overing on death. It was just it was brutal. And then even stage 6 as well, like the boss rush, was that was also quite the experience. That actually made me quit for a little bit, because I was like, I don't know what to do. What do I do? The wrappings from the mummy are flying all over the screen. They scare me. But yeah, and then even stage 7 was a little tricky. So again, as I said, I'm not someone that usually plays a lot of difficult games, and so it was very much it was a very different experience for me, really. But it was an enjoyable one.
I love pointing that out. So I feel like death fights in Castlevania are kind of somewhat notorious, and this one definitely lives up to the hype. I had a very similar experience. I swear it must have taken me an hour on stage 5 myself the first time through. And then I don't know, so I don't know if this was your experience, but my first playthrough of Rondo, I didn't unlock Maria. I knew that she was around somewhere, but I was trying to do it without guides and I had seen some of the speed runs and things like that, but I was trying to do just completely blind. So I couldn't find where she was at. And it is a tough fight to begin with, but with Richter, it just makes it, you got having a sub weapon that works and everything. It can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I didn't unlock. I didn't save anyone actually in my first playthrough. I saved the world, but at what cost?
Yeah.
No, I had no idea where anyone was initially, so I played through the whole thing as Richter, and so especially that death fight. Like, there's no, at least in the earlier Castlevanias, there's usually a good way to cheese the death fight, whether it's holy water. Well, it's pretty much always holy water.
Yes.
But in Rondo, even in the speedrun, we don't really have a good sort of cheese, and so it's like, just kind of get used to dodging the scythes, really.
It's funny you say that, because it was interesting. That's one thing I've noticed about some of the Richter strats. There are times where we don't have good cheese for something, and so we're still playing it like somebody would on a casual playthrough,
Exactly. And I think that's partly, it's partly down to the fact that, Rondo as a speedrun or as a speed game as a whole has still a lot of room to sort of improve and grow, and for new things to be found. I always maintain there's probably a lot to still be found with this game.
I totally agree. And that's actually a great segue to dive into some of the speedrunning aspects of this game. There are many categories. There wasn't always many categories, but perhaps take us through a little bit of what the main category, we'll start with the main categories first, and what those entail as far as like completion.
Okay, so you've got the any % category, which is starting from a fresh file and is pretty much Richter all the way through the game. You've got Maria only, which starts from a file where you've already got Maria unlocked, starts from stage 1, don't have to do the prologue, and then all the way to Dracula, defeat Dracula. Jolly good. Then there's 100%, which is also from a fresh file, but you have to start as Richter, you go and unlock Maria, and then she's then faster for completing the entire rest of the game. And then there's 100% Richter only, which is literally doing everything but just with Richter, basically. And so they're they're the main entry points, and they all have their own sort of different interesting aspects to them.
And we're going to get into it. And I think it's important, I guess, first to highlight the differences between Maria and Richter. Richter's kind of, there were some of the things I'm like, what was original? I played so many of them now. I forget what was some of the new things for, the Belmont character, in this game. And if I'm correct, the item crash is one of the newest things that they've added compared to the previous generations. And is there anything else that makes them kind of unique?
So Richter can obviously backflip, which is a key part of the run. He can item crash, which is where he just uses a lot of hearts to do either one of the many really powerful moves with the different sub items. He has like a whip extension as well, which is where if you tap forward right as the whip is extended, it'll extend a little further. I never found that was too useful, but it's kind of cool. Another change they made with the Belmont this time is that they removed the double and the triple items. So in previous Castlevanias, if you wanted to throw multiple sub-items, you needed to get one of the stone tablets by building up a multiplier by hitting candles. Whereas in Rondo of Blood, it's entirely dependent on how many hearts you have. So I think it's around 20 hearts for most items. You then start to unlock a double, so like double axe, you can have 2 axes on screen, and then it's something like 30 hearts, or maybe 35 or something to have a triple. And so that was another interesting change they made. I mean, they kind of built upon the NES Castlevanias. They sort of moved away from CV4, or maybe you could argue CV4 was the one that moved away. So only whipping horizontally now instead of the 8 directions that had just been seen in CV4.
And that's kind of one of the things playing through CV4 currently right now. I'm like, oh, this is kind of nice being able to move in those the 8 directions.
Yeah, I suppose my issue with CV4, as much as I did enjoy it, is it at times it kind of felt like the level design didn't quite catch up to how powerful that whip was in a way.
Totally agree with that. That's one thing I've noticed. I'm like, you don't always or necessarily need it, and I thought that was kind of an interesting choice, or perhaps maybe they're just trying to make it approachable for all types of players.
Yeah,
which
I think
I totally get.
you're exactly right there, because I think I read a developer interview. I think it was where they said when they were designing CV4, they wanted to make it a little more approachable, a little easier, a less of a experience as maybe some of the earlier ones were.
The NES Famicom games are something else. They every time I've played through one, it lives up to the hype on the difficulty scale, and especially I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I played through Rondo before I played through any of the NES versions, and so I found the first Castlevania really a challenge. It took me 10 hours or so to get through it. The NES hard thing really felt like it lived up to the hype.
I definitely agree with that. I spent quite a while on Castlevania 1. Castlevania 3 is probably the hardest game I've ever beaten. And there were just points in that game where I just burst out laughing just from the sheer absurdity of what was unseen. Like, sorry, how much do you want me to do here on one life? Excuse me.
The tower climb, or the tower fall, I should say, in CV3, I had hours. I don't remember. I shouldn't say wasted. It just was so challenging for me.
Yeah, and especially they made it harder as well.
They really did. So you mentioned the whip extension and also the item that when you get a certain amount of hearts, that's when you get the item upgrade. Those things aren't apparently obvious, at least when I played. And I thought that was kind of interesting that it's not something where like you got an icon or you got an item that said, hey, you're going to be able to do this. And at first I was kind of like, man, bum, I didn't get a chance to experience some of those things in my first playthrough. But secondly, that's actually kind of fun that there's this discovery to the game, that there's all these things that there's not like in CV2, there's not a character telling you to go, there's not an NPC telling you to go somewhere. A lot of these things you kind of have to discover on your own in the game.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool hidden things like that. I mean, like even Maria's Guardian Knuckle, I think the way they sort of brought that in is really cool. For anyone that doesn't know, like Maria has a very special sort of a powerful Guardian move where you do a sort of up, down, left or right forward and attack the enemy so you can get the input right.
Street Fighter.
She'll do a Guardian Knuckle, which is just loads of damage, but it's not in like very clear initially how to do it. But they did actually put a video in the game itself that you can like purchase with the money you collect in the game. And yeah,
where is this?
In the there's a tactics section under like stage select. And
I've never actually got into that menu.
You can actually buy videos in that, and that gives you ideas of how to fight even the different bosses. But there's like a hidden one at the end, which when you unlock it, it shows Maria's Guardian Knuckle. I don't know if it shows the inputs, but it definitely at least shows the knuckle to show you it's in the game.
Oh my god!
Yeah, there's loads of like hidden things like that. There's a room in the game that I had no idea it was there until a couple months ago, and I've been playing this game for 2.5 years. In stage 5, you can actually go behind the engine, and there's like a secret room with some sort of mirror in. It's like, what? Where did this come from?
Yeah, I had. Oh my god, I'm discovering things. This is wild. That one I actually did, and I think I might have accidentally discovered that one on my casual playthrough. Interestingly enough, I thought I was, oh man, I'm breaking something, I'm unlocking something in the game, and now it's just a hidden area that was programmed in that way.
I have a feeling it was possibly some unused idea because it's just so random. But I almost love things like that in games because it makes you excited, makes you think, what was this used for? What could this be used for? It's really cool.
Dog developer in the chat. So money has a use in this game. Yeah, apparently it does. Yeah. I did not know that either. So
it's always nice. I mean, I've never been someone that's really cared about score, so to actually have a use for all the money that you're collecting is really nice. So you mentioned one of Maria's attacks is her Guardian Knuckle. Tell us a little bit about her character and what some of her special abilities are and things like that for her. So Maria, as I understand it, was sort of designed as a sort of soft, easy mode. So she was given a lot of extra movement options that Richter doesn't have. The double jump, which obviously makes a lot of the platforming considerably easier. She has the roll, which just makes her go really quickly across the screen. The slide. She has her own item crashes as well. She has like a standard attack of just throwing doves everywhere. And then obviously the aforementioned Guardian Knuckle, which just rips apart the vast majority of bosses. And it's all round just a very powerful character with all the different items as well, which are really cool, to be honest. Like, they put a lot of effort into this side character, which is just, it's so cool.
I always claim that she breaks the game, but I think a more appropriate way to describe it is like an easier mode for people to play, because she really, you feel very overpowered when you're playing with her.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, really break the game, because as I understand it, the developers actually, said that she was very buggy for a long time and caused them a lot of problems in development, trying to get her to, not break the game entirely. And now as speedrunning, we prove that there are still some bugs left.
We have found some. That is darn sure. That's so really cool. Okay, so one of the things I also thought, and you mentioned it, but I just want to highlight the fact that the items are different for both the characters. So when you're picking, if you picked up an axe for Richter, for Richter, it's not, there are no axes for hers are all animal based and everything. There's cats and more birds and all these things. It's just turtles.
Yeah, so Maria, so Richter has the standard Castlevania weapons of dagger, axe, cross, and then also the Bible.
Yeah,
I'm thinking in my head, have I forgotten one? But I think that's them. And then Maria has the has animals that all do really cool different effects. So she has the turtle, which makes her invincible, and she can still move around. And sometimes a tiny little turtle will fall on top of you as well, which is really cool. She has like a bird, which like or a cardinal rather, that sort of shoots directly up. Has a cat that will just sort of hit the opponents multiple times and will also swim if you're near water, which is really cool. And then also has a dragon which does like tons of damage, and then like really like detailed item crashes as well. It's like, wow.
And some of them require a ton of hearts, depending on which one you're doing and things like that. The turtle one, I think, is only 10 hearts, but like when you get into the dragon, I mean, I think you need 25 or something really high. I don't remember exactly how many it is.
I can't remember now, but it's a lot of hearts for the dragon one. But it's kind of worth it, because they're such a spectacle, really, when you use them, that it is worth the heart investment, at least sort of playing through it casually.
I totally agree. So let's take a look at the any percent category. So what are some of the things that you probably where you might start with, or some of the strats, or some of the mechanics that make the any percent category work and happen? And so what are some things we should start with any percent?
So I think the most obvious thing is certainly the first thing people will notice when watching it is the backflipping. I mean, when I first saw an any percent run, I looked at it and was like, nope, not doing that. No, thank you. I'm good on that front. But it's basically what happens is Richter has a backflip, and when he's backflipping, it's slightly faster than walking. However, what Richter also does is at the end of the backflip, he will do a slide, and that slide animation sort of wastes frames. So what we do is we backflip Richter in the air, and then not too early because he'll still slide, but we sort of time it as to when Richter's flat on his back in the air. You then whip, and all of a sudden you will land on the ground and then can continue backflipping. Usually to do that, it's a little easier to hold the whip for the cancel, so you can sort of moonwalk backwards while chaining the backflips. And so each one of those, say somewhere between 0.15 and 0.2 seconds, or somewhere around there. But over the course of the run, when you're backflipping everywhere, that can add up to a real notable amount of time. So yeah, that's probably the most obvious. Like, Richter doesn't have too much in the way of like precise tricks. Honestly, Rondo as a whole, compared to maybe if you look at Castlevania 1, which is full of like very specific precise tricks, Rondo as a whole doesn't really have much in the way of precision. Like, there's one backflip that sort of skips an area in stage 7 that Richter can do that is close to frame perfect. Not entirely sure if it is, but it's close. But other than that, it's any percent is very much about the movement and also managing the RNG, which is another big aspect of Rondo as a whole. It is probably one of the more RNG heavy Castlevania speedruns. Obviously, not as much as something like Castlevania 2, but there's quite a lot to deal with, and it also makes it harder to optimize.
So I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it's one of the things it's not obvious, especially when you're watching the game casually as a fan, like I was. Some of the earliest runs I saw were by Scavenger, and it didn't look like there was this until he started mentioning, like, look, notice that enemy wasn't there. Look at all these extra enemies I'm having to fight in this screen. It seems legitimately like between every checkpoint, there is going to be some form of enemy movements or the amount of enemies that you're going to see on screen.
Yeah, I think it's sort of ingrained into my brain at this point. It's all the different ways the video game can ruin one's day. But in a way, it adds variety in a way, just to see all the different patterns and stuff and how to deal with them. I would prefer if there was a little less. Like if we were talking specifically about any percent like Richter, because Richter has less things to work with. He deals with RNG much worse than Maria. So there was one particular section in stage 5 where we call it the troll sword. And for some reason, Maria's sub-items can hit the sword instantly, but Richter's do not affect it at all. So what you end up having to do is you either get a quick sword where it comes down instantly, or the sword will just fly above the screen and we shall never see it again for at least like 10 seconds, and then the run's over. So that's where a lot of runs sort of struggle. And we've tried figuring out RNG manips and is it frame based, and that's something else we don't fully really understand about the game, is how does the RNG actually work? Is it a global timer? Is it sort of based on when you enter the room? Is it a mixture of the two? And so it's kind of hard to establish how it all works, but RNG is definitely a notable issue.
It really is. And now we are fortunate to have some tasks, tools as speed runs of the game and things like that. I don't think we've had one in years, but so, but even at that point, you can just keep grinding until you get the RNG you need. I agreed with you that I don't know if anybody done any deep dives into, I guess, I don't even know how you would start to analyze. I guess you'd have to really run the game a bunch of times. I don't even know how we decide sometimes on RNG stuff. That's outside of my expertise.
I suppose you can recognize patterns from just seeing them enough. You can kind of have a feel for how things are gonna go. There's definitely there's some things that only have a couple of set things that will happen. Let me think. Stage 2, for example, there's or alternate stage 2, I should say. There's the skeletons with the swords. They only have 2 patterns, and they'll do one of the other. And even they might be manipulatable to some extent based on how far away or how long it takes to hit them and stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of things that we simply don't know, like some boss movements. But then there's some things that will behave the same way. It's just what's very confusing. Like the Dullahan boss, for example, will behave the exact same way every single time as long as you do the same thing. So a lot of different variations to understand, I guess.
It's something that I shouldn't discourage you from trying out the game, at least in my opinion, because the game is so much fun just playing through the characters and going through the mechanics and all of the fun tricks that are going to be involved and stuff. That, however, if you start grinding for a better and better time, when you get so good at the game, that part can be a little bit challenging, having to reset when you haven't done anything. Like if you get through 2 stages and you're all of a sudden 6 seconds behind or 3 stages because you got a bad boss 3 pattern, it's kind of brutal.
And something else to mention is that a lot of the RNG elements, that you can deal with them. It's not it's not like you can't sort of react. So there's a lot of times with the different patterns, you just have to sort of adjust and get used to sort of, okay, if the boss is going to move this way, then I should probably be here. I should probably time the axe here. If I see this particular attack, I probably shouldn't do this. And in a way, it almost adds a little sort of strategy to the run. But yeah, definitely, I wouldn't discourage anyone just because of the RNG. It's the trade-off is the game currently, anyway, as it stands, the speedrun, it does have more RNG, but it also doesn't have a lot of the frame perfect, precise stuff that other games do. So it's a nice trade-off, at least currently.
Before we move off of any percent, what are some of the things that you think could lead to faster times? The game, you've even mentioned it's not completely optimized. There might be some discoveries. What are some of the things that you could see possibly happening to bring these times down?
Well, it's hard to say, really. I think the big thing is more consistent RNG minutes, or for example, Troll Sword. What happened with Troll Sword for me is for the longest time I was just getting consistently bad Troll Swords, and I was like, I don't understand what's going on here. No one else. Is it just because I am AgentWyvern? Do I see such horrid luck? And I was like, okay, let's specifically do bad movement here. So I specifically started doing slightly inefficient movement, like a bit of a stutter before I reached the sword, and I suddenly noticed my chances of getting a good sword went drastically up. So I think more sort of understanding of the RNG, because I feel like it's then once you can combat the RNG better, it's a lot easier then to work on specific optimizations. In other stuff, though, there's a couple of damage boosts could maybe be worked in. There's some maybe quicker fights on some of the bosses, especially death. If some sort of multi hits on death can be done more consistently. And yeah, it's just also whatever other glitches or whatever could be found. Really, who knows what people could find really in the game.
I want to echo something you mentioned, and one of the things that intimidated me about playing any of the Richter categories was similar to you, is that backflip mechanic and things. I think once you get used to it, which actually it didn't take me as long as I thought it was going to take to actually get comfortable with it, and then just finding where those times are to execute backflips and do it properly when you're reacting to certain enemies. I think that's one of the things you're talking about too. When you're reacting to the patterns and things that are RNG based, they're going to be different. So you can't just play through it. It's not the same exact inputs every single time you play through it. I guess that's my point.
I like the backflip a lot because it's also, you get used to it, but then it's also, you can change it. Like you can have longer backflips if you need to just make it a bit further. You can have sort of shorter backflips if okay, I need to be quick here. And you do really get used to it. It's such a unique form of movement. Trying to find the most comfortable way of doing it, or the best controller. Like for me, I went through a few different controllers. Obviously started on PlayStation 4, but when I went to Wii Virtual Console, I eventually settled on the Wii Remote. I think it was Inabito that suggested it to me. Why not try the Wii Remote? And so that's what most of my times are now done on. Are just at least for Richter, are just using sort of holding it almost in sort of a confusing claw grip. Just doing double jump whip. But yeah, it's I would say it's intimidating, the backflips, but once they're not too bad to get used to. I would say it just takes a bit of practice, and that doing a moonwalk. But the most important advice I could give for doing the backflip movement in Rondo is hold the whip when you cancel, so you can moonwalk, and it makes it so much easier to chain the backflips rather than just doing backflip, okay, next backflip, okay, next backflip.
Great advice, and completely agree. And I know I was intimidated by some of the different grips for controller. I know that sounds silly, but I was, because I have played video games for 20 years the same. I've holding the controller the same way. So trying something out was definitely different. But once it just takes, because we're speedrunning, we're doing this repetitively. It just takes a few reps of it, and after a while you get used to the thing.
Yeah. And plus, how I did it's probably not very efficient. Like, it was the first speedrun I'd ever done, and I found that having when I was playing Maria, just having the thumb for jump and attack, I couldn't go between dove and roll fast enough. But that's probably just me, and so I ended up using the side of my finger for the attack button, and then the thumb for the jump button.
There you go.
That kind of carried over to every other speedrun I did, and eventually when I came back to CV Castlevania 1 this year, I was like, hang on, let's just not do this for literally